My name is Susan. Currently, I am juggling a busy career while raising my only son, Ethan. My passion for work didn't fade even after getting married. As the president of a small company, I had no worries about a salary cut when I returned from maternity leave. Even during the hectic times of childcare, I had entrusted my business to a reliable team, so there were no concerns on the professional front. However, there was another issue that weighed heavily on my mind, something more personal and challenging. It was about my mother-in-law, Dorothy. My husband James and our son Ethan and I live in a house, and ever since my father-in-law passed away, my mother-in-law Dorothy suddenly moved in with us. Initially, we thought she'd soon return to her own home, but Dorothy showed no signs of leaving. One day, I asked her, "Dorothy, how long do you plan to stay with us?" In a dramatized manner, she raised her voice and began to cry.
Are you trying to kick me out? How can you say to me, a widow who lost her husband, to live alone in my old house?
I was taken aback by her reaction, feeling a mix of surprise and confusion. Just then, James, who had overheard our conversation, rushed to Dorothy's side and comforted her.
Are you all right, Mom? I will never kick you out. Please, stop crying.
After Dorothy, James' mother, finally stopped crying and James asked her to go to her room, leaving me alone, he immediately glared at me and burst out.
Hey! How can you be so cold to my mother? Are you heartless or what?
James was not present from the beginning, so he might not have understood the whole situation. But I hadn't told Dorothy to stay at home. I gently clarified, all I did was ask your mother how long she plans to stay. I didn't mean to tell her to leave or anything like that. James, however, interpreted my inquiry differently, saying,
Asking how long she's going to stay sounds like you're telling her to hurry up and leave. Can't you understand how people feel?
I acknowledged that my words might have been misconstrued by Dorothy, but I never intended to drive my mother-in-law away. It was frustrating for me to be misunderstood and to see James so quickly take his mother's side, concluding that I was in the wrong. With no other choice, I reluctantly backed down. I was wrestling with my thoughts about my mother-in-law, Dorothy, who had been staying in their house for an extended period. I was curious about when Dorothy would leave but felt unable to ask directly. I feared that asking would lead to emotional repercussions, with Dorothy complaining to her son, James, about being unwelcome. In their home, Dorothy behaved as though it were her own, showing little regard for my comfort. On one unexpected day, Dorothy made a startling announcement. She had decided to relinquish her ancestral home and transfer all her belongings to my house. This declaration came as a moving truck, driven by Steve, a friendly but straightforward mover, pulled up in front of their house. I was speechless with astonishment, my mouth agape in disbelief. That day was supposed to be special for me and James's son, Ethan, who had been eagerly anticipating a family outing to the amusement park. However, James, standing beside his mother, disrupted the plans by declaring it a day for unpacking. Ethan, who had been looking forward to the amusement park visit, glanced between me and James with a near tearful expression, seeking reassurance about their plans. Comforting my son, I assured him, "Don't worry, Ethan. We'll definitely go to the amusement park." However, James frowned, questioning,
Are we really going to play instead of unpacking?
I firmly responded that a family trip to the amusement park had been a long-standing plan. I argued that breaking a promise to their child for unpacking was unthinkable. I stood my ground, believing in the righteousness of my stance. The plan to visit the amusement park had been set over a month in advance. We had prepared various things and were looking forward to this day. Spending time as a family is crucial for us. Yet, it was a complete surprise to hear that my mother-in-law was suddenly moving into our house. Moreover, being told that today was the day for unpacking, we were nothing but bewildered. I prioritize our family plans above all. It's my policy to cherish the bond with my family. However, my mother-in-law reacted emotionally to my decision. She started crying excessively, saying,
Susan doesn't want to live with me. That's why she's prioritizing her own child over me.
Hearing this, the mover, Steve, realized the conversation wasn't progressing and, seemingly exasperated by my mother-in-law's theatrical sobbing, calmly inquired,
Well, unpacking can be done anytime. Isn't keeping a promise with your family more important? Also, did you actually inform daughter-in-law about the move?
Perhaps embarrassed by Steve's rational words, my mother-in-law's face turned red. In that situation, my husband James just glared at me, uncertain of how to react. It seemed he preferred to prioritize unpacking for his mother over going to the amusement park with our son. Nevertheless, I took Ethan's hand and headed to the park as promised. This incident created a clear rift between my husband and me.
Hey, Susan, could you possibly stay home this upcoming weekend?
Dorothy, my mother-in-law, casually broached the subject one day, seemingly oblivious to any plans I might have already made. A surge of irritation welled up inside me, yet I strived to maintain composure in my response. "Why do you ask?" I inquired, striving to mask my annoyance with a tone of neutrality.
You know, I was hoping to spend some quality time with Ethan, but it seems you're always around him. It's quite unfair, don't you think? I barely get any opportunity to bond with him.
Dorothy's tone was tinged with a hint of accusation, as if I was the root cause of her limited interaction with Ethan. It was apparent she had eavesdropped on my earlier conversation about a mall outing planned with Ethan for the next weekend. She began to assert that I should avoid joining them at the mall. Instead, she suggested a scenario where James, Ethan, and herself would go, leaving me to oversee the house alone. "If you're keen on visiting the mall, why don't we all go together?" I proposed, hoping to strike a balance and not let Ethan out of my sight, especially not with Dorothy, whose trustworthiness had been in question since the day I witnessed her feigned tears. Dorothy's expression morphed into a mix of reluctance and disappointment. She was cornered by my proposition. Voicing her displeasure was not an option now. With evident reluctance, she nodded in agreement, conceding to the new plan. At the shopping mall, I was selecting clothes for my son Ethan, just as I had planned. I knew that children grow up fast, so I was picking out slightly larger sizes. Suddenly, my mother-in-law, Dorothy, came over and said,
"Don't you know his size? This size would fit Ethan perfectly."
She had chosen a size that fit Ethan just right for now. I tried to explain. "Kids grow so quickly, it's better to have a bit of room in their clothes." But Dorothy quickly retorted,
"When he grows, just buy new ones. Don't be so stingy."
I was internally taken aback by her attitude. Continuously buying perfectly fitting clothes would be a waste of money. Our family budget couldn't afford such frequent purchases. I resisted, but then my husband, James, intervened, saying,
"I'm paying the bills. If you're stingy, it reflects poorly on me."
Ultimately, James paid for the clothes Dorothy had picked out. Afterward, Ethan wore those clothes for a while, but in just a few months, he started complaining,
"This is too tight,"
and stopped wearing them. Dorothy saw this and her face showed a mix of emotions, a complicated blend of realization and disappointment. I had decided to sort out the unnecessary clothes overflowing in our home, among which many were no longer in use. I chose to give these clothes to a mother friend of mine, whom I got close to at the daycare center attached to our company. She was delighted to receive them, and seeing her joy warmed my heart. However, my use of this daycare center seemed to be something my mother-in-law couldn't come to terms with. She didn't try to hide her critical attitude towards me.
"Why would you leave Ethan with someone else when I'm right here at home and working while having a child? That's detrimental to his upbringing."
She challenged me with a stern tone. Her words pierced deeply into my heart, but I felt the need to firmly state my position. "Actually, I need to work too, or our finances wouldn't make ends meet," I replied, calmly yet with a firm resolve. But my mother-in-law further criticized me.
"Just how much do you think your earnings amount to? I'm sure James brings home much more than you, so you wouldn't need to work for us to live comfortably. You must be incompetent at your job,"
she accused. Her words deeply scarred me. At that moment, I wondered if James had ever mentioned to her that I was the president of our company. James, often prideful, might not want his mother to know that his wife earns more. Frustrated with this realization, I felt the need to find a new way to navigate this complex relationship with my mother-in-law. "I actually earn more than James, you know, mother-in-law," I said, her voice laced with a mix of confidence and a hint of sarcasm. Little did I know, this remark was about to ignite a fiery response from Dorothy, my mother-in-law.
"How dare this daughter-in-law speak like that?"
Dorothy raised her voice, a blend of shock and anger seeping through her words.
"To belittle one's husband is unforgivable. Not only does she barely manage to care for our child, but she also has James assist with the household chores. And now she boasts about earning more than her husband. Can't she even show the slightest respect for him? James wouldn't struggle a bit without you around."
Dorothy's voice grew louder, filling the room with her indignation. Hearing the commotion, James entered the room, a look of concern etched on his face.
What's going on?
He asked, sensing her son's presence as a form of support. Dorothy continued with even more vigor.
Tell me, James, you don't need Susan, do you? If it were just you, me, and Ethan, we could live happily. This woman's presence only makes our lives more constrained, doesn't it?
James, slightly taken aback, responded hesitantly.
Well.
His lackluster reply seemed to fuel Dorothy's resolve.
Then let's go for a divorce,
she exclaimed, retrieving a divorce form from the shelf. It appeared that Dorothy had been harboring the intention of suggesting a divorce to me and James all along. I, internally wrestling with the turmoil, had come to realize that she no longer needed a husband who prioritized his mother over his own family. Yet, I was determined not to give up custody.
Everything about you is unbearable. You are no longer needed in our family of 3.
James shouted, his voice trembling with anger. The echo of his words filled our once peaceful living room, symbolizing the collapse of our years-long marriage. Longing for freedom from this house, or rather this relationship, I responded calmly. I understand, James. I signed the divorce papers with a steady hand, marking the end of our relationship. Our family consisted of me, my husband James, and our grown son Ethan. However, ever since my mother-in-law Dorothy moved in, the tension in our home had been escalating. Dorothy, disregarding our plans, had forced me to help her unpack her belongings, ruining Ethan's and my eagerly awaited trip to the amusement park. When I began preparing for the move, she abruptly took James on a hot spring vacation. Ethan had been invited by Dorothy as well, but having witnessed her mistreatment towards me, he declined, preferring to stay with me. He was still upset about how Dorothy nearly canceled our amusement park plans. Respecting Ethan's decision, James and Dorothy left for their trip, leaving us behind. During their absence, I packed only mine and Ethan's belongings and had them transported by the mover, Steve. In my decisive letter, I informed James that he would be responsible for the rent of $4,000 for this house henceforth, and that I would be hiring a lawyer for the custody battle and property division. Leaving the letter on the table, Ethan and I stepped into our new life. Upon their return from the week-long hot spring vacation, James and Dorothy contacted me immediately. Over the phone, James exclaimed,
Susan, did you really take Ethan with you? Mom is upset. Shouldn't I have custody?
His voice was a mix of anger and surprise. I realized he hadn't read the letter I left. Could you please read the letter I left on the living room table? I asked James gently. The living room, a space she had designed with great care, radiated warmth. She harbored serious concerns about the content of the letter.
Ha! If it's that letter, Mom said she'd check it first and she's already read it.
James responded, a bit bewildered. He had a tendency to take his mother Dorothy's word for everything. The letter says that you will be responsible for the rent of this house, which is $4,000 a month going forward. It also states that I won't give up custody of Ethan. And regarding the division of property, I'll contact you after hiring a lawyer. I explained the contents of the letter calmly.
$4,000.
James exclaimed in shock, standing frozen. He was aware of the rental status of their home, but had not grasped the actual amount. His cavalier attitude towards financial management had always been a source of stress for me. This house was a rental, costing about $4,000 monthly, which I had initially opposed living in. However, James had been adamant about this house, throwing a fit in an unbelievable manner, and I eventually gave in. James, leveraging the fact that she was a company president, had argued,
You can afford it.
And thus had pushed the responsibility of paying the rent entirely onto me. As a result, I ended up paying the monthly rent of approximately $4,000, and James was supposed to take care of other living expenses. However, James habitually spent money without planning, often leaving me to foot the bill. Their experiences at the shopping mall were a classic example of this. Similarly, his mother Dorothy also had trouble with financial calculations. She would often go to the checkout without considering the amount she had and then call me over when realizing she didn't have enough money. I was deeply disappointed with their inability to manage money. Therefore, James often ended up spending the money on his hobbies and desires before paying the living expenses. I was exhausted from James' lack of financial planning. For a long time, I worked for the family, contributing my entire salary to the household. This left me with very little money for myself, making life extremely challenging. Recently, the burden intensified with the increased expenses for Dorothy's food and allowance. However, the prospect of divorce meant shedding the hefty $4,000 monthly rent. Fortunately, the house was in James's name, who liked to show off, sparing me from future responsibilities towards him and Dorothy.
Impossible to pay such an amount. Keep paying it as before.
James exclaimed. Why should I pay? I don't live there anymore, and we're divorced. Dorothy even told me to leave the house, so I have no obligation to pay rent, I retorted.
Please, I'm begging, help me.
James pleaded desperately. At this moment, Dorothy snatched James's phone, and her voice came through.
Even without you, we can manage the rent. The amount you paid is nothing for James.
She declared confidently. Really? With a net income of $2,000, you can pay $4,000 monthly rent. How is that possible? He asked incredulously, with a hint of sarcasm. Dorothy sounded puzzled. She had been under the impression that James was still well off, probably because he always paid during shopping trips, leading her to mistakenly believe in his financial abundance. I was absolutely flabbergasted. There's no way James, with his take-home pay of around $2,000 and hardly any savings, can afford the rent. And I can imagine that people who can even pay their rent can properly raise a child. Even without Ethan's opinion, it seems inevitable that I would get custody. After all, how could James and Dorothy provide a stable environment for raising a child?
So, what on earth are we supposed to do now?
If you can't pay the rent, the only option is to move out. We need to talk to the real estate agent about canceling the lease. The later it gets, the more likely we are to end up paying $4,000, I urged. Dorothy snapped back at me.
Oh, be quiet. I know that already.
Her response was so abrupt, it seemed she didn't even have the time to feign tears. With that, I hung up the phone, my mind a whirl of emotions. I and Ethan recently moved into an apartment in a neighborhood that was not only close to my workplace, making her commute a breeze, but also surrounded by convenience stores and medical facilities, creating a comfortable living environment. About a month after mid-divorce, an unexpected turn of events unfolded when my ex-husband, James, and mother-in-law, Dorothy, surprisingly showed up at my workplace. They caused quite a scene at the company's entrance, demanding to see the boss, which was me myself. I, who was out for lunch with Ethan at a family restaurant at the time, was taken aback when I returned with Ethan in tow, only to find Dorothy and James causing a commotion at the reception. The child care center inside the company allowed me to have Ethan close, even at work. The sudden appearance of James and Dorothy left me bewildered, especially since I had been waiting for a response to a meeting arranged by their lawyers. Dorothy, with tears that seemed more manipulative than genuine, pleaded with me.
Susan, can't you just come back home? I understand you were the one providing financially, but enough with this sulking. It's time to put an end to this.
It was clear that Dorothy believed her tearful act would work on anyone besides her son. She was intent on painting me as the villain in this situation. In response to Dorothy's theatrics, James chimed in.
Hiring a lawyer, what were you thinking? This is a matter between us as a couple. Ethan would surely be happier with both his parents together.
Despite his words, a father who prioritizes his mother over his own son only adds to the child's sorrow. Sighing deeply, weighed down by inner turmoil, I turned to James and said firmly yet calmly, "We're divorced, we're strangers now. If you have something to say, please do it through a lawyer." Upon hearing this, James seemed to realize that talking to me was futile. He turned to our son, Ethan, who was standing beside his grandmother, and began speaking.
Hey, Ethan, you'd prefer to stay with your dad and grandma, right?
James said, attempting to sway Ethan.
Absolutely. It must be lonely just with your mom, always busy with work,
Added the grandmother, chiming in with her own persuasive tone. Ethan, seemingly frightened by this exchange, hid behind me and burst out crying loudly.
I don't like you both. You're mean.
His pure tears were far more impactful than the grandmother's feigned weeping, resonating strongly with everyone around. Employees from nearby offices quickly gathered, responding to the commotion. They assured James and the grandmother out of the company, restoring a semblance of order. Relieved at being freed from this distressing situation, I let out a sigh of relief. Later, through my lawyer, I warned them that if they ever showed up unannounced at my office or followed me and Ethan, I would consult the police. This warning seemed to calm them down. James and his mother, who were previously living in a house costing $4,000 in rent, had to let go of their luxurious lifestyle and move into a modest apartment. But the real tragedy for James was just beginning. He had been boasting to his colleagues about living in a lavish house, and now, terrified of them discovering his downgrade to a humble apartment, he quit his job without consulting his mother. This abrupt decision infuriated his mother. Eventually, they both had to start working out of necessity. Despite their new jobs, they spent their days blaming each other for losing Ethan, engaging in bitter arguments. They struggled to pay child support while trying to make ends meet, a situation that was challenging for them. As for me, I've been doing well in my job, and despite the absence of a father, Ethan has grown into a sturdy and reliable young man. In my heart, I always believed that even without such an unreliable father figure, I was capable of raising this child admirably.